What would you do if your dignity was challenged in front of strangers, and the person humiliating you was someone with the power to decide your place? Dr. Celeste Morgan, a brilliant and accomplished woman, steps onto a luxury flight, only to be confronted by an entitled flight attendant who assumes she doesn't belong in first class. But Celeste is no ordinary passenger. Unwilling to back down, she faces the demeaning behavior with a calm that unsettles everyone around her, turning what seemed like a routine flight into a battle for respect and recognition. But when Patricia, the flight attendant, crosses the line with a physical slap, Celeste reveals something even more shocking. She is the owner of the airline. The passengers, who had once judged her, are left questioning their assumptions. What happens when you challenge the very systems that dictate who belongs and who doesn't? Can one act of resistance shift the course of a flight? And perhaps the lives of everyone on board? Get ready for a story that forces us to confront our own biases, stand up for our dignity, and question the status quo. Like, share, and subscribe to follow Dr. Celeste Morgan's powerful journey and join the conversation on what it truly means to stand your ground. The flight has just begun. The terminal windows gleamed with the last light of afternoon, pouring a warm gold across the polished floors. Travelers streamed in every direction, rolling suitcases clicking rhythmically against tile. Some hurried, their faces tight with schedules. Others lingered, drifting slowly as if reluctant to leave the ground. I walked with neither haste nor hesitation. My steps were steady, deliberate, the kind of pace that belonged to someone who had walked this road many times before. My suitcase glided behind me, its wheels whispering rather than rattling, and the scarf draped over my shoulders moved lightly in the breeze of the climate vents above. At the gate, the aircraft stood waiting, its body catching the dying sunlight. Sleek lines curved across the fuselage, gleaming like brushed silver. It looked less like a machine than a promise of distance shortened, of worlds connected, of journeys worth remembering. The boarding area was hushed compared to the bustle of the concourse. Here, voices dropped to register, softened by anticipation. First-class passengers had already been called. A couple with expensive coats and the unmistakable aura of wealth stood at the gate, speaking to the lead flight attendant. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder and waited for them to move ahead. Their names were greeted warmly, almost theatrically. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore," the attendant said, her smile bright as stage lights. "It's always a pleasure to have you with us." The Whitmores smiled back with the entitlement of regulars who expected this kind of deference. The woman adjusted her pearl necklace with a satisfied air. Together, they stepped through the jet bridge, their laughter carrying faintly back toward me. Then it was my turn. The same flight attendant, her badge read Patricia Harlow, shifted her expression when her eyes landed on me. The brilliance of her smile dimmed. The corners of her mouth stayed up, but the warmth was gone, as though she had pulled down a shade over her own light. "Welcome aboard," she said. The words were clipped, polite only by obligation. I gave a small nod, not showing anything on my face. I had long ago accepted that some people decided who you were before you even said a word, no matter what proof you carried, tickets, credentials, or history. They measured you against their own silent categories. The jet bridge was cool, its metal walls humming faintly with the air conditioning. My hand brushed along the side as I stepped onto the plane. A faint scent met me inside the cabin, something warm, faintly floral, mingled with the clean undertone of polished leather. The first-class cabin whispered wealth in every detail. Wide leather seats, the the color of dark espresso, gleamed softly under the ambient lighting. Gold accents glinted on the edges of fixtures, subtle but deliberate. Trays already held crystal glasses, some half filled with champagne, that caught and fractured the overhead glow. Passengers arranged themselves with the easy grace of those who were used to belonging here. Coats of fine wool lay folded across armrests. Handbags of rare leather rested at their owner's feet. I rolled my suitcase forward, my steps still even. My seat was near the front 2A, by the window. I knew exactly where I was going. As I lowered my bag into the compartment, I felt Patricia's eyes on me. She was nearby, her posture attentive for the Whitmores as they settled in across the aisle. Her smile for them was almost radiant, her voice honey-sweet. "Can I offer you champagne before we depart, or perhaps sparkling water?" The tone shifted when her gaze returned to me. Her hands clasped behind her back, and her voice dropped lower, quiet enough at first to be mistaken for polite inquiry. "Ma'am, I believe this is the wrong section." I turned slightly, meeting her eyes. My voice was calm. "This is my seat." Her lips pressed together into a line. "This section is reserved for our elite passengers," she said. "Louder now." The man seated one row behind looked up from his phone. His suit was a clean charcoal gray, his tie neatly knotted. He frowned slightly, then lowered his gaze, though his ears remained tuned. I did not raise my voice. "You may want to check your passenger list." "I don't need to check anything," Patricia replied, her back straightening as if her authority grew taller with each syllable. "I know who belongs here and who doesn't." A murmur stirred in the cabin, faint but audible. Someone whispered. Maybe she wandered up from the back. Another voice added, "Why not just move?" I did not turn my head toward them. My hands rested lightly on my lap. Inside, my thoughts drifted not to anger, but to memory. The countless times strangers had decided my place before they knew my name. The quiet indignities that accumulated like stones, heavy yet familiar. I closed the seat belt around my waist with a click. The buckle was final, undeniable, a small act of certainty in a room full of assumptions. Patricia lingered beside me, her presence sharp as a shadow. Her jaw shifted as if she was preparing her next words. But she didn't know yet who she was speaking to. And that, I thought, would make all the difference. The cabin hushed again, though tension curled like smoke around us. Outside, the last sliver of sun slid beneath the horizon, leaving the aircraft bathed in the soft blue of early evening. The engines murmured faintly through the floor. The journey was only beginning, and so was the story no one on this plane would forget. The cabin seemed to hum with a rhythm of its own, as passengers settled into their wide leather seats. There was a choreography to it, the rustle of expensive coats being folded, the clink of crystal glasses being lifted, the murmur of low conversation from lips practiced at discretion. Everything in first class suggested that comfort and belonging were privileges earned elsewhere and brought here like invisible tickets. I placed my scarf across my lap and let my eyes wander over the details. The wood veneer along the paneling was polished to a warm sheen, reflecting the soft glow of overhead lights. The carpet was thick beneath my shoes, a muted navy that muffled footsteps into near silence. I noticed how some passengers leaned back into their seats with easy familiarity, as though this was less a journey than an extension of their living rooms. Across the aisle, Margaret Whitmore removed a small bottle of hand lotion from her designer bag. The faint scent of lavender drifted over as she smoothed the cream into her palms. Her husband Charles adjusted his cufflinks, the silver catching the light. Their movements spoke of habit, of long familiarity with this space. They belonged here in the way people do when no one ever asks them to prove it. I leaned back into my own seat, adjusting the headrest, allowing myself the small luxury of a deep breath. Yet even as I tried to settle, I could feel the difference. Patricia moved with an ease that was almost graceful when she passed by the Whitmores. Her smile lingered for them. Her words dipped in warmth. "Can I refresh your drinks? We'll be departing soon. Champagne is always available." "Of course." Margaret responded with a laugh that floated like silk. "You read my mind." She extended her glass, and Patricia refilled it with a flourish, the bubbles rising as though even the champagne understood it was being poured into the right hands. Then Patricia's gaze shifted to me. The smile faded as if it had never existed. Her words, when they came, were stripped bare of inflection. "We'll bring water once we're underway." It was subtle, but sharp enough to notice. I caught the shift in the businessman's expression, in the row behind me. Edward Blake was his name, if memory served. He wore his suit like armor, not flashy, not meek, but practical and intentional. He had looked up from his phone earlier, and now his gaze lingered for a second too long before returning to the screen. He had seen it too. I kept my voice quiet, almost gentle. "If it's not too much trouble, could I have a glass now?" Patricia's reply carried an edge. "As I said, once we're underway." She moved past me without pause. The cool air from her passing brushed against my cheek. In that silence, my thoughts stirred again. I wondered why, after so many years, these moments still stung. It wasn't anger that rose in me, but a kind of heavy ache, the kind that comes from recognizing a pattern you thought the world might have outgrown. I told myself to let it settle, to breathe. My hands rested loosely on the scarf in my lap, my fingers smoothing its fabric as though calming myself by touch. A whisper reached me from 2 rows ahead. A woman with neatly pinned hair leaned toward her husband, her pearls swaying as she moved. Her words were meant to be quiet, but they carried just far enough. She probably just wandered up here. Mistakes happen. Her husband gave a half smile, the kind that suggested agreement without commitment. Their eyes flicked back toward me for a heartbeat, then away. I straightened my posture, refusing to shrink. The seat was mine. The ticket was mine. I had no reason to fold myself smaller because of their doubt. From the rear of the cabin, a younger attendant appeared, holding a passenger manifest in her hands. Her badge read, "Sophia Nguyen." She couldn't have been older than her late 20s. Her eyes shifted between Patricia and me with an uncertainty that betrayed her conscience. I was just going to confirm, she began. Patricia cut her off before the words could find air. "I've handled it," she said, her voice firm, her body turning slightly to block the manifest from my view. Sophia's lips pressed together, but her eyes lingered on me for a moment longer. There was something in her expression, fleeting but unmistakable. Recognition, perhaps, or the quiet understanding of someone who had witnessed this kind of dismissal before. Then she lowered her gaze and stepped back, her shoulders tight as she retreated toward the galley. The small exchange left a ripple in the air. I could feel it, though no one spoke of it directly. The businessman behind me adjusted in his seat, a faint sigh slipping through his lips. Even the Whitmores, though cocooned in their privilege, glanced my way with something less than indifference. I sat very still, hands folded, gaze forward. The leather of the seat warmed under my body, molded to shape. It was as though the chair itself understood my belonging better than the person whose job was to ensure it. The hum of the engines began to rise, a steady vibration underfoot, a reminder that soon we would leave the ground behind. I found comfort in that sound. It was impartial. The engines did not care who sat where. They carried everyone equally into the sky. But Patricia's shadow lingered. She passed me again on her return trip, her tray now lighter, her steps brisk. She did not glance at me. She leaned toward Edward Blake instead, offering him a glass with polished courtesy. He accepted it, his eyes flicking once more toward me. This time, he didn't look away as quickly. He studied Patricia, then shifted his gaze back to me, and for the first time, he shook his head slowly, almost imperceptibly. I caught the movement in the reflection of the brass trim near my seat. It wasn't solidarity spoken aloud, but it was acknowledgement. And in moments like this, acknowledgement carried weight. As Patricia moved away, the silence she left behind grew heavier. It pressed against me, not with noise but with meaning, the kind of silence that tells you the room is watching, measuring, waiting to see what will happen next. I felt the eyes on me. Some were curious, others judgmental, still others quietly sympathetic. I had lived long enough to know the difference, and though my chest ached with the familiar sting of being misjudged, I would not let that ache define me. Instead, I let my breath settle into an even rhythm. In, out, in, out. Each breath was a reminder of patience, of control, of power held quietly rather than displayed loudly. The intercom chimed softly overhead, a signal from the cockpit. The captain's voice had not yet spoken, but the sound reminded the passengers that authority existed beyond the aisle, beyond the small dramas of human prejudice. Patricia returned once more, carrying a tray balanced with glasses of water. She stopped at the Whitmore's row, her voice sweet again. "Here you are, always a pleasure." The glasses caught the light, sparkling as though they were meant for a celebration. When she reached me, she stepped around, her tray still half full, and leaned to hand a glass to Edward Blake instead. Then she continued without pause. Her back turned before I could speak. My throat was dry, but my patience held steady. I waited until she passed again. "Excuse me," I said softly, my voice carefully measured. "Could I have some water? Please." She stopped, her hand gripping the tray. Her eyes narrowed. "I'll get to you when I can." The words carried no pretense of courtesy. Then she moved on, her heels clicking lightly against the carpet. Edward lowered his glass slightly, shaking his head. His disapproval was quiet, but visible, a private verdict rendered in silence. The air in the cabin shifted again. The murmurs rose faintly, a wave too soft to crash, but strong enough to carry. I heard fragments, pieces carried from seat to seat. Why not just serve her? What's the harm? Doesn't make sense. And yet Patricia moved with certainty, as though she alone defined the rules of this space. I sat back against the seat, the leather warm against my shoulders. My hand brushed once more across my scarf, grounding myself in its softness. I would not rise. I would not argue. Not yet. The journey had only just begun, and though Patricia thought she was in control, she had no idea how the story would end. The engines purred beneath the cabin floor, a steady vibration that seemed to press against my bones. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to it, allowing the sound to anchor me. It was impartial, a reminder that the machinery of flight didn't distinguish between passengers. It lifted everyone the same. But human beings were another matter entirely. When I opened my eyes again, Patricia was back, standing in the aisle just a step away. She clasped her hands behind her back, shoulders squared as though she were presenting herself for inspection. Her smile was gone now, replaced by a thin line that hinted at irritation more than professionalism. "Ma'am," she began, her voice low but firm, "I think you're in the wrong seat." My hand rested on the armrest. I turned my head slowly, meeting her eyes. "This is my assigned seat." Her lips tightened, and she leaned slightly closer. "This section is reserved for our elite passengers." The words carried enough weight to reach the ears around us. Margaret Whitmore tilted her head, her pearls catching the light as she leaned toward her husband. He gave a quiet chuckle, not loud, but audible. Behind me, Edward Blake lowered his phone onto his lap. His gaze was steady now, attentive. I let a beat pass, then spoke in the same calm tone. "If you'd like, I can show you my boarding pass." Patricia's jaw shifted. "That won't be necessary." The contradiction hung in the air. Her refusal was not about protocol. It was about perception, about who she decided belonged. And in that decision, she had already drawn her line. A whisper drifted from 2 rows back, just loud enough to travel. "Why doesn't she just move?" Another voice added, "Probably trying to sneak up here." The words landed in my ears with a familiar sting. They reminded me of 100 other rooms, 1,000 other moments, when strangers' assumptions became verdicts before I even spoke. I kept my gaze steady on Patricia, refusing to turn toward the whispers. "You may want to be certain before you keep saying that," I said quietly. Patricia's eyes narrowed. Her voice rose just enough for more passengers to hear. "I don't need to check anything. I know who has seats here." Sophia reappeared at the far end of the aisle, the manifest clutched in her hands again. She hesitated, her steps slowing as she approached. Her lips parted as though she meant to speak. But Patricia moved swiftly, stepping into her path with a subtle shake of her head. "I've handled this," Patricia said firmly. Sophia froze for a moment, her gaze flickering between Patricia and me. Then, with her shoulders stiff, she stepped back again. But before she turned away, her eyes met mine. And in that brief connection, I saw it. She knew the truth. She had seen this kind of thing before. And though she couldn't act now, the weight of it sat heavy on her face. The silence in the cabin thickened. Even the soft clink of ice in champagne glasses seemed to pause. Edward Blake shifted behind me, the sound of his suit brushing against leather as he leaned forward slightly. "Maybe it wouldn't hurt to check the list," he said. His voice calm, measured, would save everyone some trouble. Patricia's head snapped toward him, her expression cooling further. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but this is a matter of protocol." Edward didn't flinch. He folded his arms across his chest, his tone unwavering. "From where I'm sitting, it looks more like a matter of assumption." The murmur that followed was softer this time, but it was there a ripple moving through the rows like a current beneath the surface. Some passengers avoided looking directly at me, their eyes darting instead to Patricia, watching her more closely now. I adjusted the cuff of my blazer, the movement slow, deliberate. Then I lifted my gaze again, steady as stone. "You really don't want to keep this going," I said. Patricia's chin lifted. "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning." Her breath caught, just briefly, though she tried to mask it. The aisle between us felt like a standoff, her authority against my patience. Her lips parted again, this time sharper. "If you're determined to make this difficult..." I can have you escorted to your proper seat before we leave the ground. Call whoever you need to, I replied, my voice even, my eyes never leaving hers. For a moment, she held my gaze, but then she stepped back, the flush rising along her neck betraying what her posture tried to conceal. She turned on her heel, retreating down the aisle with quick, clipped steps. Around me, conversation stirred once more, though it carried a new tone. The passengers were curious now, not about me, but about her. I sat exactly where I was, posture unshaken, hands still resting on my lap. The first warning had been given. Whether she chose to listen would determine what came next. Patricia returned moments later, carrying a tray with crystal glasses of water that caught the cabin light. She began at the front, her voice warm and cheerful for the Whitmores. Here you are. Such a pleasure. Their smiles bloomed like flowers under sunlight. When she reached my row, she didn't glance at me. She leaned around, offering a glass to Edward Blake instead, her tray balanced carefully in her hands. Then she continued without pause, moving on to the next row as though I didn't exist. I watched her pass, my patience tested but intact. My throat was dry, but I let the silence hold. Finally, on her return trip, I spoke, my voice soft. Excuse me. Could I have some water? Please. She stopped, her hand tightening on the tray. I'll get to you when I can, she said curtly, before moving on again. The businessman behind me lowered his glass slightly, shaking his head in quiet disbelief. The reflection of his gesture glimmered faintly in the polished brass trim near my seat. Time stretched in the hush that followed. I adjusted slightly, stretching one leg into the aisle to ease the stiffness in my knee. It was a small movement, hardly noticeable, meant only for comfort. Patricia returned with quick steps. She didn't ask me to move my leg. Instead, she veered sharply, the edge of her shoe striking my shin. The tray jolted in her grip, glasses tipping. In a blink, cold water spilled across my lap, soaking into the fabric of my slacks and dripping onto the carpet below. Her gasp was exaggerated, her voice rising above the cabin. Watch where you put your legs. Now look at the mess you've caused. Heads turned instantly. Margaret Whitmore leaned closer to her husband, lips curling in disdain. Edward Blake's brows shot up, his eyes widening. Even Sophia, standing near the galley, froze in place, her hands tightening around the manifest. I looked down at the spreading wet stain, then lifted my gaze back to Patricia. My voice was calm, clear. You walked into my leg. Her lips pressed together, her head tilting in mock disbelief. If you'd stayed in your space, this wouldn't have happened. I brushed at my lap with a napkin, my movements measured. All I've asked is to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. I said, if that's too much to ask, then maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here. The words landed like a stone dropped in still water. A ripple of reaction moved through the cabin. Edward gave a short, approving nod. Sophia's lips parted, though she said nothing. Even Margaret's smirk faltered for a moment. Patricia's grip on the tray tightened, her knuckles pale. She stepped closer, her voice dropping into a hiss. You think you can talk to me like that? I didn't flinch. I met her eyes evenly. You just made the worst mistake of your life. Her fingers twitched around the tray, her breathing sharper now, audible over the steady hum of the engines. For the first time, a flicker of uncertainty flashed in her eyes. She shifted her weight, poised as though bracing herself. And then, without warning, she raised her hand and struck me across the face. The sound cracked through the cabin, sharp, undeniable. Gas erupted. The Whitmores froze mid-sip. Edward pushed halfway out of his seat, his eyes wide. Sophia's hand flew to her mouth, her body trembling. The sting bloomed across my cheek, but I did not lift a hand to touch it. I did not lean back. I did not look away. My stillness unsettled her more than if I had shouted. A murmur spread, scattered voices threading through the hush. Did she hit her? Is she allowed to do that? Someone call the captain. Patricia's voice cut through, too loud for the space. You've been disruptive since you stepped on this plane. Maybe now you'll understand. There are rules. I let her words roll past me. My own came quiet, firm, final. You've crossed the line. Her jaw tightened. You think I'm afraid of you? I tilted my head slightly. Not yet. The aisle between us burned with the tension of a truth she could no longer control. The sting on my cheek spread outward in slow heat, but my pulse remained steady. I did not touch the mark she left, did not give her the satisfaction of seeing me react. My silence was heavier than her slap, and she felt it. Patricia shifted her stance. Trey clutched like a shield, her eyes darting briefly around the cabin. The passengers were no longer pretending not to notice. Every head was turned. The Whitmores leaned forward, Margaret's pearls trembling against her collarbone. Edward Blake sat upright now, his arms folded tightly across his chest, his expression fixed in disbelief. Sophia Nguyen lingered near the galley, her face pale, her lips pressed together as though she were holding in a protest that refused to stay quiet. Patricia straightened, forcing a brittle confidence back into her voice. This passenger has been disruptive since boarding. I will not tolerate defiance. Her words carried through the cabin, but they did not land with the certainty she wanted. The murmurs that rose in response were not agreement. They were doubt, curiosity, even disapproval. I let the silence expand until it felt like the very air had thickened. Then I spoke, my voice calm and even. You've made your decision, Patricia. Now you'll live with it. For the first time, I saw her blink, a small fracture in her authority. Edward leaned forward slightly, his voice low but audible. Unbelievable, he muttered. Patricia's head snapped toward him, her smile gone, her tone sharp. Sir, this is none of your concern. He raised an eyebrow, his composure unshaken. It became my concern the moment I saw you strike a passenger. Gas rippled again. Margaret covered her mouth, though her eyes betrayed something closer to fascination than horror. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze flicking between Patricia and me as if weighing which side would serve him best. Patricia turned back to me, her jaw set. You are making this harder than it has to be. I kept my hands folded loosely in my lap. I think you've already decided it's difficult. Her lips parted, but no words came. She shut her mouth again, her nostrils flaring with restrained fury. Sophia stepped forward then, just enough to be seen. She held the manifest close to her chest, her knuckles pale against the paper. If I could just confirm her seat assignment, Patricia spun, her tone icy. Sophia, return to your duties. I said I have it handled. The younger attendant hesitated, her eyes flicking to mine. There was an apology in them, unspoken but clear. She stepped back, though not all the way. Her presence remained, a quiet rebellion that pulsed beneath her obedience. Patricia turned back to the aisle, her face flushed. She adjusted her jacket, trying to regain the shine of authority. Then she moved away, the tray clattering faintly in her grip. The cabin remained tense, every passenger caught between silence and the urge to speak. The air felt charged, as though the engines beneath us had shifted from hum to growl. I leaned back into my seat, exhaling slowly. The water on my lap had cooled, dampening the fabric against my skin. But I ignored the discomfort. My focus was on patience, on endurance. I had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful response was not action, but stillness. Patricia reappeared minutes later, her expression carefully smoothed into professionalism. She carried another tray, this one with wine glasses, their liquid dark and rich under the lights. Her smile reemerged when she approached the Whitmores. Her voice honeyed once again. "Here you are, Mr. and Mrs. Whitmore, your favorite red." The couple accepted their drinks with approving nods, their earlier tension dissolving beneath the comfort of recognition. Patricia lingered just long enough to bask in their gratitude before turning her attention to Edward Blake. "Sir, would you like a glass of wine?" she asked, her tone respectful. Edward looked at her for a long moment before answering, "No, thank you." His refusal carried more weight than the words themselves. When Patricia's eyes flicked toward me, I met them steadily. "I'll take water now," I said, my tone quiet but firm. She pressed her lips into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll return when I'm able." She stepped past me, continuing down the aisle without pause. Edward shook his head, his disapproval now visible to everyone who cared to notice. The murmurs in the cabin thickened again, threads of conversation weaving through the silence. Why is she ignoring her? She's clearly in the right seat. This is going too far. I shifted slightly in my chair, stretching my leg again, careful this time to keep it within the boundary of my space. Still, Patricia's steps quickened when she returned, as though she were eager for another confrontation. Her shoulder brushed mine as she passed, deliberate rather than accidental. The tray rattled faintly in her hands, the glasses trembling against one another. She leaned down suddenly, her voice low, meant only for me. "You think you can embarrass me? You don't know who you're dealing with." I kept my gaze forward, my voice calm. "Neither do you." Her breath hitched, and for a moment her eyes widened. Then she pulled back, her lips tightening into a thin smile. The businessman behind me muttered again, louder this time, "She's out of control." Margaret Whitmore gave a quiet laugh, though it lacked conviction. "Perhaps she should have just moved," she said, though her eyes no longer carried the certainty of judgment. The tension built like pressure in a sealed cabin, every second adding weight. Patricia had crossed a line, and everyone knew it, but she was not finished. She returned once more, her tray now empty, her hands free. She paused beside me, her stance stiff, her breathing audible. She bent slightly, her face close enough for me to see the strain tightening the muscles in her jaw. "You are not going to win this," she whispered. I turned my head slowly, meeting her eyes. "Winning isn't my goal." Her confusion flickered for just a heartbeat before she masked it again. She stepped back, straightening her jacket with a sharp tug. The cabin had shifted. The passengers who had once whispered against me were now watching Patricia instead. Their eyes were sharper, more skeptical. The balance of perception had begun to tilt. I let the silence hold, my hands folded, my posture unyielding. Patricia thought she had control, but control is not a mask you can wear. It is a truth revealed when pressure mounts, and under pressure, hers was already cracking. The engines hummed louder beneath us, signaling the beginning of taxi. But just as the plane began to roll, a subtle change interrupted the rhythm. The motion slowed, then stopped entirely. The sudden stillness carried through the floor, through the cabin, settling into every passenger's awareness. Heads lifted, eyes turned. Patricia stiffened, her gaze darting toward the cockpit. The intercom clicked, the captain's voice calm but formal. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've received special instructions from ground control. We'll be holding position for a short while before departure. Thank you for your patience." The words landed differently for different ears. For most, they were a minor inconvenience. For Patricia, they were something else entirely. Her shoulders tightened, her face shifting as though she were trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. Her eyes flicked to me. They lingered longer than they should have. I remained still, my face serene. My patience was not weakness. It was strength measured in silence, in control. Sophia emerged from the galley then, her steps slower, steadier. She moved with a composure that seemed new, as though she had crossed an invisible threshold. She did not look at Patricia. Instead, she walked past her, slipping into the jump seat near the front, buckling herself in. Patricia's face darkened. "Is there something I should know about?" she asked under her breath. Sophia did not turn her head. "Not from me," she replied quietly. The words cut sharper than a shout. Patricia stood frozen for a moment, her confidence shaken. Around us, the passengers leaned forward, curious, unsettled. Edward's eyes narrowed, his interest fixed. Margaret's magazine lay forgotten on her tray table, her earlier smugness replaced by unease. The tide was shifting, and Patricia could feel it, but she had not yet realized that her downfall had already begun. The air inside the cabin carried a weight that no one could ignore. It pressed against shoulders and filled the spaces between rows, thick with tension and unspoken questions. I could hear the hum of the engines beneath us, but now it was just background noise against the silence of dozens of eyes turning toward Patricia. She stood in the aisle, her uniform immaculate, but the sharpness of her posture betrayed strain. Her fingers curled against the seams of her skirt, tightening and releasing in restless rhythm. She scanned the passengers, searching for reassurance, but none came. Even those who had whispered earlier now avoided her gaze. Margaret Whitmore clutched her glass of wine tightly, as though holding on to the last shred of comfort she could control. Charles shifted in his seat, his hand resting uneasily on the armrest. Their certainty had faded. What once seemed like a disruption caused by an unwelcome passenger now looked very different. Edward Blake leaned slightly into the aisle, his expression steady, his eyes locked on Patricia. He did not speak yet, but his silence was louder than words. The weight of his judgment hung in the air like a verdict waiting to be pronounced. Patricia smoothed the front of her jacket, forcing a smile that barely lasted a second. Then her voice cut through the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly." The words were for the cabin, but her eyes never left me. I let her performance pass without response, my gaze forward, my hands folded loosely in my lap. Sometimes silence unsettles more than defiance, and she could feel it. Minutes ticked by in uneasy quiet. The engines remained idle, the faint vibration beneath the floor a reminder that we were still motionless. Conversations rose in soft threads, passengers exchanging whispers they no longer bothered to hide. She really hit her. Unbelievable. Why hasn't the captain stepped in? Patricia returned, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. She stopped at my row, leaning in close enough that only I could hear. "If you think your silence intimidates me, you're wrong. I'll have you escorted off this flight before we leave the ground." I turn my head slowly, meeting her eyes, then call them. But when you do, make sure you understand what we're inviting. For the first time, I saw hesitation flicker across her face. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced with renewed resolve. She straightened, her chin lifting as she raised her voice for the entire cabin to hear. Security will be contacted to remove this passenger if she does not comply. Gas rippled through the rows. Even Margaret flinched, her glass trembling in her hand. Charles muttered something under his breath that I could not hear, but the unease in his tone carried clearly enough. Edward Blake rose halfway from his seat, his voice firm. "That's enough. I've been sitting here watching you single her out from the moment she boarded. She has been nothing but calm, and you've crossed every line of professionalism." The murmurs that followed were no longer whispers, but voices rising in agreement. A man 2 rows back spoke up. "He's right. We all saw what you did." Patricia spun toward them, her composure cracking. "This is not a debate. I am in charge of this cabin, and I will not be questioned." Her words echoed back at her, brittle, hollow. The authority she claimed was already slipping through her fingers. I leaned back, my voice carrying just enough to be heard. Control is not something you declare. It is something you hold. And right now, you've lost it. The stillness that followed was profound. The hum of the engines, the soft chime of a glass settling onto a tray table, even the rustle of Margaret's pearls, all of it seemed amplified against the silence that fell after my words. Patricia's breathing grew sharper, audible in the hush. She glanced toward the galley, as though hoping for Sophia to step in. But Sophia remained where she was, her eyes fixed on me with a quiet strength that did not waver. Patricia turned back to me, her voice trembling now with restrained fury. "You think you can humiliate me in front of my passengers?" I shook my head slightly. "I don't need to. You've done that yourself." The businessman's quiet laugh carried through the aisle, low but undeniable. More murmurs rose, this time edged with something Patricia had not anticipated recognition. The passengers were no longer watching me with doubt. They were watching her with judgment. Her face flushed crimson. She stepped closer, her hand twitching at her side as though she wanted to raise it again, but knew the weight of the cabin would not let her. "You don't belong here," she hissed. I tilted my head, my voice measured, steady. "Belonging is not yours to grant or deny." The words landed like stones in still water. Their ripples reached every corner of the cabin. Patricia's mask slipped further. She clenched her fists, her composure unraveling before the eyes of those who once trusted her to lead this space. And then, salvation arrived not for her, but for the truth. The cockpit door clicked open, the sound drawing every gaze forward. Captain Robert Hale stepped into the aisle. His presence shifted the atmosphere instantly. Conversations hushed, backs straightened. Even Patricia instinctively adjusted her posture, but he did not look at her. His eyes found me first. His voice, calm and formal, carried the authority of the flight deck. "Ma'am, we've received instructions from ground control. I need to check in with you personally. Would you like to continue this flight, or would you prefer alternative arrangements?" The cabin erupted with murmurs. Passengers leaned toward one another, voices urgent with curiosity. "Check in with her. Why is he asking her?" Patricia's eyes widened, confusion flooding her features. She stepped forward quickly, her voice sharp. "Captain, there must be some misunderstanding. This passenger—" He lifted a hand, silencing her without a word. His gaze never left mine. The question is for her. Patricia froze, her mouth hanging open. The authority she clung to dissolved in an instant, stripped away by the captain's quiet gesture. I met his gaze evenly, my voice calm. "I'll continue?" He nodded once. "Very well. We'll make the necessary adjustments." He turned back toward the cockpit, but not before casting Patricia a look that made her shift uncomfortably in her own skin. As he disappeared behind the door, the cabin remained hushed, the silence no longer thick with doubt, but with dawning realization. Eyes turned back to me, searching for answers they could not yet name. Patricia's voice broke through, brittle with desperation. What exactly is going on here? I did not answer. Her voice dropped lower, a tremor threading through it. "Why is he talking to you like that?" Edward Blake leaned forward, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Maybe you're about to find out." Patricia's eyes flicked to him, then back to me. Her confusion deepened. For the first time since the flight began, she looked uncertain of her place in this cabin. I adjusted the crease of my blazer, letting the movement speak in place of words. My silence was not surrender. It was power, measured and controlled, waiting for the moment it would reveal itself. The cabin had shifted entirely. The balance of authority had tipped, and Patricia, though she did not yet understand, was already standing on ground that no longer belonged to her. The engines hummed again, but not with the rhythm of departure. It was a low vibration, steady but subdued, as if even the aircraft understood we were not yet cleared to rise. The cabin air carried an electricity that words could not disguise. Passengers shifted in their seats, some leaning forward, others glancing furtively toward me, toward Patricia, toward the cockpit door that had closed just moments before. Patricia stood frozen in the aisle, her hands gripping the hem of her jacket. The authority she had once wrapped around herself like a second skin was slipping. She tried to recover it, her chin lifting, her voice finding strength again. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, forcing a brightness into her tone, "please remain calm. We will be departing shortly. There is no cause for concern." But her words fell flat. They lacked the conviction of before. Too many eyes had seen too much. Edward Blake leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on her. He didn't speak, but his silence was cutting. The passengers behind him mirrored his stillness, watching Patricia with a new kind of scrutiny. I remained in my seat, hands folded, eyes forward. My cheek still carried the faint sting of her earlier strike. But I let it rest there, not as pain, but as reminder. Power does not always come from rising to meet aggression. Sometimes it comes from refusing to be moved by it. Patricia's steps quickened as she moved down the aisle, adjusting trays that did not need adjusting, straightening headrests already perfectly aligned. It was theater, a performance to reassert dominance, but the audience was no longer convinced. I saw it in the way Margaret Whitmore leaned toward her husband, whispering now with a furrowed brow instead of a smirk. Charles shifted, his eyes restless, betraying unease. Sophia emerged quietly from the galley, her expression unreadable. She moved past Patricia without a word, sliding into the jump seat at the front. Her hands rested on her lap, but her spine was straight, her composure unshaken. She did not look at me, but her presence was a silent declaration. She was not going to disappear into the shadows this time. Patricia noticed. "Sophia," she said sharply, "what are you doing?" "Following procedure," Sophia answered, her voice calm, almost too calm. Patricia's eyes narrowed. "Procedure is what I say it is." The words slipped out with more honesty than she realized. A murmur rose in the cabin, faint but undeniable. Passengers exchanged looks, recognition passing between them. Her mask had slipped again, and this time, no one could unsee it. I exhaled softly, smoothing the crease of my blazer. My patience was not infinite, but it was purposeful. Every second she exposed herself made the truth heavier, clearer. The intercom chimed. The sound was gentle, but it carried weight. All eyes lifted. "Ladies and gentlemen," the captain's voice came, steady, formal. "We are awaiting confirmation from ground control before we proceed. Please remain in your seats." The announcement should have reassured, but instead it sharpened curiosity. Why was ground control involved in what should have been a routine departure? Why had the captain spoken directly to me? Patricia's steps faltered. She smoothed her jacket again, her movements growing sharper, more brittle. Her eyes flicked toward me, then away, then back again. The questions in her mind were visible now, etched across her face like cracks in porcelain. She approached my row again, lowering her voice. "What exactly is going on here?" I met her gaze steadily. "You'll know soon enough." Her lips pressed into a line, but the unease in her eyes betrayed her. She straightened and turned sharply, moving toward the front. Edward's voice followed her, quiet but cutting. "Maybe you should stop before you make it worse." She ignored him, but her stride lost some of its confidence. The passengers felt it too. The tide had turned. The whispers now were not about whether I belonged, but about her, about what she had done, about what the captain knew that she didn't. I leaned back, letting the silence work. Sometimes silence is louder than accusation. Sometimes it forces people to confront their own conclusions. Minutes passed. The engines hummed without motion. The stillness grew heavier, pressing against every row. Then, the cockpit door opened again. Captain Robert Hale stepped out, his expression composed, his uniform crisp. He walked down the aisle with calm authority, but his direction was clear. He did not glance at the Whitmores, nor at Edward, nor at Patricia. He came straight to me. "Dr. Morgan," he said quietly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear, "Ground control has asked for your decision. Do you wish to proceed with this flight?" A ripple of shock moved through the cabin. Whispers erupted like sparks. "Dr. Morgan, decision." Patricia's face drained of color. She stepped forward quickly. "Captain, you can't be serious. This passenger—" He lifted a hand, silencing her once again. His gaze remained on me. I inclined my head slightly. "We'll continue." He nodded. "Very well." His voice carried authority, but there was respect in it, a deference Patricia had never shown. The captain turned and walked back toward the cockpit. The murmurs did not fade. They thickened, swelling with curiosity, with dawning realization that something was unfolding far beyond what they had expected when they boarded this flight. Patricia stared at me, her lips trembling as she struggled to form words. "Who are you?" she whispered. I smoothed the fabric of my blazer again, unhurried. "You'll find out." Her confusion deepened. She glanced toward the passengers, as though searching for support. But their faces were no longer hers to claim. They were watching her, judging her, measuring her against the standard she had shattered with her own hand. Edward Blake leaned back in his seat, a small smile pulling at his lips. His voice was quiet, but it carried just enough to reach Patricia. "This should be interesting." Margaret clutched her pearls again, her earlier smugness gone, replaced by unease. Charles shifted in his seat, his discomfort written plainly across his face. Even those who had once whispered against me now sat in silence, their eyes fixed on me as though waiting for an answer that would reframe everything they thought they knew. I let the moment linger. Power does not always come from speaking first. Sometimes it comes from letting others feel the weight of not knowing. Patricia finally broke the silence. Why is ground control? Why is the captain talking to you like this? I turned my gaze toward her, my voice calm, steady, deliberate. Because this isn't your cabin. It's mine. The words hung in the air, subtle yet undeniable. They did not reveal everything, not yet, but they carried enough to make every passenger sit straighter, to make Patricia's breath catch, to make the weight of the truth start to settle. I leaned back, my hands resting easily on my lap. The reveal had only just begun, and Patricia, whether she realized it or not, had already lost. The hum of the engines reverberated faintly through the cabin floor, steady but unmoving. We were still holding on the runway, though time felt suspended in a different way now. Every passenger's attention was fixed not on departure, but on the drama that had taken root in first class. Patricia stood rigid in the aisle, her face pale beneath the cabin lights. Her earlier confidence had curdled into something brittle, a sharp edge that no longer convinced even herself. She smoothed the fabric of her jacket again, a nervous tick disguised as poise, but her hands trembled just enough to betray her. I sat with measured calm, my hands folded on my lap, my breathing steady. Inside, my mind moved with clarity, replaying the sequence of events that had led to this moment. The slap, the dismissal, the ridicule whispered by strangers that could have cracked me if I allowed it. But strength is not about avoiding impact. It is about absorbing it without breaking. Across the aisle, Margaret Whitmore leaned closer to her husband, her voice a low whisper. Something is happening here, Charles. Something we don't understand. Her pearls rattled softly as she spoke. Charles adjusted his tie, his discomfort etched clearly on his face. Best to stay out of it, he muttered, though his eyes never strayed far from me. Edward Blake, still seated behind me, broke the tension with his steady tone. She deserves an explanation, he said, directing the words toward Patricia. We all saw what you did. Now it's time we learn who we're really looking at. Patricia spun toward him, her voice sharp with strain. This is none of your concern, sir. But Edward only leaned back, his arms folding with ease. It became my concern the moment you decided to humiliate a passenger in front of an entire cabin. You don't get to erase what we saw. The murmur of passengers swelled again. People leaned across aisles, whispering hurriedly, their eyes darting between Patricia and me. The balance of perception had shifted. Where once I had been the target of suspicion, now it was Patricia who bore the weight of scrutiny. Sophia remained in the jump seat at the front, her posture calm, her gaze steady. She did not interfere, but her presence was its own kind of statement. She was no longer hiding behind obedience. She was watching, and she wanted Patricia to know it. Patricia's breathing quickened. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping into a hiss meant only for my ears. You've been nothing but trouble since you boarded. I don't care who you think you are. I won't let you embarrass me in front of these people. I turned my head slowly, meeting her eyes. My voice was low but clear. You don't need my help to embarrass yourself. You've done that already. Her face flushed crimson, her lips trembling as though holding back words too dangerous to speak aloud. She straightened abruptly, trying to collect herself, but the effort only made her look more unsteady. Then the cockpit door opened once again. Captain Robert Hale stepped out, his uniform sharp, his stride measured, the cabin stilled at once, every whisper falling silent. Authority had entered the aisle, and even Patricia stood taller at the sight of him. But his eyes, steady and unwavering, were fixed on me. "Dr. Morgan," he said respectfully, "Ground Control has confirmed their request. They would like you to make your position clear to the cabin." The murmurs erupted instantly, louder this time. Confusion rippled through the rows. Passengers craned their necks, their voices carrying disbelief. "Doctor, what position? Why is he deferring to her?" Patricia's eyes widened. Her lips parted, but no words came. She turned toward the captain. "Desperate, Captain. This is outrageous. You're undermining my authority in front of everyone." His voice cut her off, calm but final. "Your authority ends where hers begins." The silence that followed was profound. Patricia blinked, her mouth still open, her face pale as the weight of his words settled over her. I rose slowly from my seat. The motion drew every gaze in the cabin. The businessman behind me leaned forward. Margaret clutched her pearls tighter. Charles straightened in his seat. Even the murmurs ceased, as though the very air held its breath. I adjusted the lapel of my blazer, smoothing the fabric with deliberate calm. Then I turned to face the cabin, my eyes sweeping across the rows of faces. Some curious, some guilty, some wide with dawning recognition. "My name," I began, my voice steady but caring to the farthest corner, "is Dr. Celeste Morgan." The cabin was silent, hanging on every word. I built this airline from nothing. One route, one plane, one passenger at a time. I am the sole owner of this company, and every aircraft you step on bears the weight of my promise that all who fly with us will be treated with dignity and respect. Gasps erupted. Edward nodded slowly, his suspicion confirmed. Margaret's lips parted, her earlier arrogance replaced with shock. Charles sat frozen, his eyes wide. Patricia staggered back a step, her face draining of color. She shook her head slightly, as though refusing to believe what she had just heard. "That's not possible," she whispered. I turned my gaze directly to her. "What happened here today is the very thing I vowed would never happen under my name. You decided who belonged and who didn't, without ever looking at the truth. And you crossed the line the moment you raised your hand against me." Patricia's lips quivered. Her body swayed as though the ground beneath her had shifted. The murmurs in the cabin swelled. No longer whispers, but open voices. "She owns the airline? Did you hear that unbelievable?" Sophia stood from the jump seat now, her voice soft but steady. "I tried to tell you. Patricia, she was on the manifest. You refused to listen." Patricia spun toward her, desperation lacing her words. "You should have backed me up." But Sophia did not flinch. "I backed up what was right, and you know you were wrong." The words cut deep, sharper than any reprimand. Patricia recoiled, her composure shattered completely. I lifted a hand, not to silence, but to steady the space. "This is not about one bad day. Patricia, this is about the choices we make when we think no one is watching. The choice to treat someone as less. That choice ends here." The captain gave a short nod, signaling to two uniformed ground staff who had appeared quietly at the cabin entrance. They began walking down the aisle, their expressions neutral but purposeful. Patricia's eyes widened in panic. "You can't be serious. You can't remove me." The captain's voice was calm, formal. "You will be disembarking before we depart." The passengers shifted, making space as the staff approached. Their eyes tracked Patricia's every move. Margaret whispered something to Charles. but her words were drowned out by the sound of Patricia's trembling protest. She stopped in front of me, her lips pressed tightly together. I didn't mean I met her gaze without flinching. You did. The words landed with finality. Her shoulders sagged. Without another word, she turned and followed the staff toward the exit. A hush filled the cabin, thick and expectant. Then, slowly, a soft round of applause began at the back, spreading forward like a tide. It wasn't loud or mocking. It was the kind of applause that came when justice had been seen. I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging their recognition, but not basking in it. Respect is not a performance. It is a promise. Sophia stepped closer, her voice quiet. Thank you for speaking up. I shook my head gently. Thank you for having the courage to stand. Her eyes widened, surprise and gratitude mingling in her expression. The weight of possibility settled on her shoulders. She understood what it meant, even if she did not yet believe it. The captain returned to the cockpit, the engines roaring back to life. The aircraft began to roll again, this time with purpose. But the true journey had already begun. The passengers shifted back into their seats, but their eyes lingered on me. They were not just watching a woman who had refused to move. They were watching the person who had built the very sky they were about to enter. And Patricia's absence was not silence. It was proof. The cabin exhaled as the door closed behind Patricia. The sound of her heels on the jet bridge faded, swallowed by silence that lingered long after she was gone. For a few suspended moments, no one moved. It was as if the air itself had paused to reset, to release the tension that had been thickening since boarding. Then the applause that had begun in the back rolled forward again, this time louder, more confident. It wasn't wild or mocking, but measured, a collective release of breath. Some passengers clapped with their palms pressed lightly together, others with slow, deliberate rhythm. It was less about celebration and more about acknowledgement that something deeply wrong had been made right. I did not rise to accept it. I simply inclined my head once, a gesture that was enough to let them know I heard, that I understood. Respect is not currency to be collected. It is a standard to be upheld. Edward Blake leaned into the aisle, his eyes steady on me. It's been a long time since I've seen someone stand that firmly without raising their voice. You reminded all of us what real strength looks like. I met his gaze briefly. Real strength doesn't need to shout. It only needs to endure. His nod was slow, his expression thoughtful, as though my words carried more weight than he expected. Across the aisle, Margaret Whitmore shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Her pearls, once her badge of superiority, now seemed like a chain she wanted to hide. She whispered something to her husband, her tone softer than before, almost apologetic. Charles gave a curt nod, but his eyes flicked toward me with something closer to respect than suspicion. Sophia remained near the front, still standing, though her hands now rested calmly at her sides. She looked at me as though she were trying to reconcile the woman who had quietly sat in seat 2A with the owner who had built the airline itself. There was admiration in her eyes, but also fear of what it meant to witness injustice and know she had nearly stayed silent. I beckoned her gently with my hand. She stepped closer, cautious at first, as though she wasn't sure whether she belonged in the space between us. You didn't stay silent, I said softly. That matters. Her throat tightened as she swallowed. I hesitated. Courage isn't about never hesitating, I replied. It's about speaking when it matters most. Her eyes shone with something unspoken gratitude, perhaps, a relief. She nodded quickly and stepped back, but not too far. She wanted to remain close enough to witness what unfolded next. The captain's voice returned over the intercom, steady and controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be departing shortly. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened and all electronic devices are secured." It was the kind of announcement every passenger had heard countless times before, but now it carried a different resonance. The voice of authority did not belong to the flight attendants alone. It belonged to something larger, something reshaped by the truth that had just surfaced. As the engines roared back to life, the aircraft began its slow taxi once more. This time, the hum beneath our feet felt purposeful, like a drumbeat leading us forward. I leaned back into my seat, letting the leather mold around me. My reflection flickered faintly in the polished brass trim of the window frame. The sting on my cheek had dulled to a memory, but its significance remained sharp. Passengers continued to glance at me, some openly, others with quick, guilty flicks of their eyes. Their curiosity was not unkind. It was laced with the weight of realization. Many of them had judged me the moment I boarded. They had whispered assumptions, measured my worth before I had spoken a word. Now they sat with the discomfort of knowing their silence had been complicity. Margaret turned slightly in her seat, her voice trembling. "Dr. Morgan, I'm sorry for what I said earlier." Her words were quiet, almost lost beneath the hum of the engines, but I heard them. I gave her a small nod. "Acknowledgement is a beginning." Her eyes glistened briefly before she looked down at her lap, her pearls falling silent against the fabric of her blouse. Edward exhaled, leaning back. This flight will be remembered, not because of where it landed, but because of what happened before it even left the ground. He wasn't wrong. Stories like this did not stay contained within cabin walls. They traveled across dinner tables, through headlines, across oceans in whispers and retellings. Sophia returned to her jump seat as the plane turned onto the runway. Her posture was straighter now, her eyes forward, her spirit steadier. She had chosen her side, and she knew it. The engine surged, pressing us back into our seats. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft accelerated, the runway blurring into streaks of light outside the windows. Then came the lift, the unmistakable moment, when the ground let go and the sky accepted us. As the plane climbed into the night, I let my head rest against the window. The city lights below scattered like diamonds across velvet darkness, each one a reminder of lives unfolding, stories being written. Inside me, a quiet storm churned. Calm on the surface, yes, but beneath it, reflection swirled. I thought of all the times before, the endless instances where someone decided my place before I even spoke. The gate agents who questioned my ticket, the hotel clerks who asked for proof twice, the strangers who assumed silence equaled inferiority. And I thought of the promises I made to myself long ago that if I ever had the power to change it, I would. This flight was proof that power isn't abstract. It is lived. It is carried in every choice, in every refusal to move when others tell you to shrink. The seatbelt sign chimed softly overhead. Passengers adjusted themselves, trays folded, books opened, headphones slipped over ears. Yet their eyes still lingered on me, as though I carried the answer to a question they didn't know how to ask. I closed my eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. Strength is not the absence of pain. It is the refusal to let pain dictate your worth. When I opened them again, I caught Edward watching me. He gave a small nod, one professional to another, one person who understood what it meant to carry weight unseen by others. I returned the nod, no words needed, from the galley. Sophia peeked around the curtain, her gaze flicking quickly to me before she pulled it back. I smiled faintly, a gesture meant for her alone. She had been part of this story too. Her courage, though small in action, had been monumental in meaning. Hours remained before we reached our destination, but I knew this flight had already left a mark deeper than miles. The applause, the whispers, the silence after truth had been spoken, all of it would ripple outward long after we landed. This was no longer just about me, or Patricia, or even this single flight. It was about something larger, about the unspoken weight carried by those who had been told all their lives that they did not belong, about the shift that happens when silence becomes strength, when dignity refuses to bend. And as the plane leveled into cruising altitude, I knew one thing for certain. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning that would reach far beyond these walls of leather and steel. Even as the initial shock faded, a tension lingered that no passenger could ignore. Sophia Nguyen hovered nearby, her hands folded over the back of a chair, uncertainty etched across her youthful face. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the same battle between loyalty and conscience I had faced countless times in my life, though in different forms and arenas. "Ma'am," she whispered, barely audible over the low hum of the engines. "Are you okay?" I allowed myself a small smile. "I am, but we have work to do." Her brow furrowed. "I don't know if I should. Patricia might do what is right." "Sophia," I said gently, "even when it scares you, especially then." Her nod was tentative, but it was a start. That moment reminded me that courage often exists in small acts before it manifests into something larger, something undeniable. The rest of the cabin was still observing. Some passengers whispered quietly, speculating about the altercation. Others simply watched, transfixed. I sensed that a ripple had passed through them, a subtle awakening that this journey was no longer just about travel. It had become a mirror reflecting their own assumptions, their judgments, and the blind spots they carried through life. Patricia's absence left a strange vacuum of authority. The remaining crew hesitated, unsure how to proceed. Captain Robert Hale's voice crackled over the intercom, calm but firm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we understand there was an incident in first class. Please be assured the situation has been addressed and will not affect our departure. We thank you for your patience." Even with his steady reassurance, the murmur among passengers persisted. The subtle tension lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon, pregnant with questions, with curiosity, with the need for closure. I leaned back in my seat, my fingers resting lightly on the armrest. My mind replayed Patricia's face as she struck me. Anger had not been my response. Instead, I felt something else, an acknowledgement of the pain her action represented, the systemic assumptions that had shaped her behavior. There was no need to punish her. The truth, when revealed, would suffice. Edward Blake spoke quietly from the seat across the aisle. "You must have endured this your whole life and still remain this composed. How do you do it?" I considered his words. Composure is not about being untouched. It is about remaining in control of what you allow to affect your spirit. He nodded slowly. "It's rare to see, and yet, when I look around, I realize most of us never consider the weight carried by those we underestimate. We forget what people endure quietly, out of sight, and assume their presence is a choice rather than a necessity." His observation resonated, and I could see it reflected in the cabin. Passengers who had once leaned forward in judgment now sat back, reconsidering, perhaps even confronting their own internal biases. The Whitmores shifted uneasily, their hands fidgeting with their accessories as if trying to reclaim composure they had lost without realizing it. Sophia finally stepped forward, her voice firmer this time. "I need to speak to the crew about how we handled this." I nodded in approval. "And you should speak the truth, even if it's uncomfortable. That is how change begins." She hesitated, then moved toward the galley, determination in her step. The other flight attendants exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. Their hesitation was understandable. They had been trained to follow procedure, to prioritize authority over ethics. And now, the rules they relied on seemed suddenly irrelevant. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the gentle sway of the aircraft beneath me settle my thoughts. Boarding, takeoff, landing, all were predictable, governed by physics and procedure. Human behavior was far less predictable, but far more consequential. The real turbulence existed here, in choices made and unmade, in courage embraced or denied. Minutes stretched, marked only by the occasional soft hum of conversation and the quiet shuffle of movement in the cabin. I could sense that change was coming, subtle but inevitable. People were noticing the discrepancy between assumption and reality, between appearance and truth. Edward Blake leaned closer, lowering his voice so only I could hear. "It's remarkable. You walk in, and in a matter of minutes, you change the atmosphere entirely. Not by yelling, not by confrontation, but simply by existing on your own terms." I smiled faintly. Sometimes existing on your own terms is all that's required for others to see the possibility of justice. The engines shifted, a slight increase in vibration signaling that we were finally clearing the runway. The flight attendants returned to their duties, glancing toward Sophia for reassurance, now guided by her quiet moral authority. The energy in the cabin had changed. Where once there had been tension, uncertainty, and fear, there was now reflection, awareness, and a tentative respect. Even the Whitmores, haughty and entitled, were subdued. Their posture was stiff, and I noticed that Margaret's hands were no longer fidgeting with her wine glass. There was an unspoken acknowledgement, a realization that the world did not bend to their prejudices as easily as they had assumed. I exhaled slowly, letting the tension leave my body with the motion of the aircraft. This was only the beginning. I knew the true reckoning would come later, in ways that would be more consequential than a slap, more enduring than an apology. But in this moment, in this cabin, we had begun the first steps toward change. The hum of the engine swelled, filling the space around me. I looked out the window at the runway, now receding as we lifted gently into the sky. The city below faded, shrinking into a mosaic of streets and lights. Yet the weight of what had happened remained. It was a weight carried not just by me, but by every person who had witnessed, who had seen truth in its simplest form. Patricia's absence had revealed more than her own prejudices. It revealed how fragile social hierarchies could be when confronted with integrity and strength. It revealed the quiet power of observation and reflection. And it revealed the potential for courage in others, like Sophia, to act even when afraid. I leaned back in my seat, my hands resting lightly on my lap. I did not smile. I did not speak. But I allowed a sense of quiet satisfaction to settle over me. The flight had only just begun, yet it already carried a lesson that few would forget. And in that lesson, I saw the possibility for a small but profound transformation, not just for Patricia, not just for the Whitmores, not just for Sophia, but for everyone in this cabin who had chosen to watch, to notice, to feel, and to question. And as we climbed higher into the late afternoon sky, I understood that power did not always belong to those who struck first or shouted loudest. True power belonged to those who could endure, who could observe, who could act with both compassion and resolve when the moment demanded it. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the seatbelt signs blinked on. Outside, the engine's growl deepened, a reminder that the journey had begun in earnest, even as the echoes of confrontation still lingered. My mind, however, was not on altitude or airspeed. It was on the fragile ecosystem of human behavior, the way assumptions and fear could dictate actions in moments of perceived authority. I leaned back, folding my hands over my lap, feeling the smooth leather beneath my fingers. The hum of the aircraft vibrated through the floor, a subtle reminder that no matter how personal the chaos seemed, the world outside moved with relentless constancy. I focused on that truth, on the knowledge that presence and patience could anchor even the most turbulent of storms. Patricia had been escorted to the galley by another crew member, leaving a void of authority that was immediately noticed. Without her looming figure, the cabin began to breathe differently. Murmurs turned into quiet conversations, passengers exchanging glances, the air lightening just enough for empathy to seep in. Edward Blake remained seated across from me, his expression still focused, but softer now. "You handled that with a calm that most of us wouldn't even recognize in ourselves," he said. His voice was measured, carrying a weight of genuine respect rather than superficial admiration. I nodded, but my thoughts drifted inward, as they often did. Calmness was not an absence of fear. It was the choice to let fear exist and act deliberately in spite of it. I had faced prejudice before, subtle and overt alike, and each encounter had been a reminder that the world was rarely straightforward. The truth, like gravity, was impartial. The reactions of those around you were optional variables that could be observed but not controlled. Sophia approached cautiously, her eyes searching mine. "Ma'am, do you think this will affect the rest of the flight?" I considered her question carefully. "It may," I said finally. "Some people will continue to judge what they don't understand, but others will see that integrity does not bend to intimidation, and that matters more than we often realize." She nodded slowly, her hands tightening briefly over the strap of her service apron. I think I understand. Her voice faltered. "It's hard to know what's right sometimes. It always is," I said softly. "Even for the most experienced among us." I could see relief flicker across her face. The weight of indecision was lifted, at least a little, by the knowledge that she was not alone in navigating it. The cabin itself seemed to recognize the shift. Passengers who had been tense, anticipating the next eruption, now relaxed marginally, their shoulders loosening, the rigid posture of discomfort giving way to a cautious observation. Some glanced at me with curiosity, others with newfound respect. I could not claim to know their thoughts, but I sensed a subtle recalibration. The story they would tell afterward would be different than the one they had assumed at boarding. Even the Whitmores shifted in their seats. Charles adjusted his cuff, but there was no smugness in his posture. Margaret's fingers lingered on the armrest, a small tremor betraying her uncertainty. Privilege alone could not inoculate anyone from recognizing when they had misjudged another human being. My gaze traveled down the aisle, lingering on faces that had previously seemed indifferent. Some had not yet spoken, their silence deliberate, perhaps reflective. Others whispered in soft tones, hesitant to make a sound, yet compelled to witness what had unfolded. In a way, I realized, this flight had become an unintentional classroom, an exercise in empathy and perception under pressure. I allowed myself a small internal smile, thinking about the irony. A simple seat assignment, a brief interaction, and the cabin had transformed into a stage revealing the complexity of human behavior. It was a reminder that no matter the altitude, the turbulence that mattered most was often internal. Sophia returned to her post near the galley, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had just made a significant choice. I watched her, noting the subtle difference in her bearing. She had witnessed the confrontation and chosen to act from her own conscience rather than fear or habit. That decision, small as it might have seemed, resonated deeper than any command or protocol. Edward leaned slightly closer. "It's remarkable," he said quietly. "You don't just assert yourself. You transform the environment without raising your voice. Most people think confrontation requires volume. It doesn't." I nodded again, appreciating the insight. There was a difference between asserting power and commanding presence. One demanded attention, the other inspired reflection. The lesson was subtle, but infinitely more durable. As the aircraft lifted from the runway, the city below shrinking into a mosaic of light and shadow, I felt a mixture of calm and resolve. The journey ahead was not just about miles or destinations. It was about influence, about observing the behavior of those around you, and about choosing when to engage and when to let truth speak for itself. The Whitmores were quiet now, their earlier smugness replaced by a tentative awareness. I could sense their internal struggle, the beginning of self-reflection that no apology could summon, but that awareness could ignite. Privilege and comfort were fragile when confronted with the quiet insistence of integrity. Patricia's absence in the aisle was notable, but I could sense the residual tension in the cabin, the energy of unspoken questions. The flight crew was professional, attentive, yet cautious, even in her absence. Patricia's shadow lingered, a reminder of how authority is wielded and how easily it can fracture when confronted with moral clarity. I rested my hands on my lap again, feeling the vibration of the engines beneath my fingers. Each pulse of movement through the aircraft's frame reminded me that we were in motion. And yet our journey had already carried lessons that no seatbelt sign could restrict. Sophia's glance returned briefly, and I offered her a nod of reassurance. She smiled faintly, a private acknowledgement that courage, once exercised, has a way of sustaining itself. The cabin fell into a rhythm, punctuated only by murmurs of conversation and the subtle clinks of glasses being set on trays. The tension that had gripped the first rows gradually dispersed, replaced with a quiet attentiveness. Passengers now observed rather than assumed, listened rather than judged. In small ways, the dynamics had shifted. The engine's deep hum became a steady undercurrent to the cabin's new equilibrium. It reminded me that turbulence was not always external. Often, it came from the judgments we carried, the assumptions we made, the moments we feared stepping forward, and sometimes the resolution came not from confrontation, but from patience, awareness, and the quiet assertion of integrity. Edward Blake finally relaxed, leaning back against his seat with a soft exhale. "I think this flight will be remembered differently than most," he said, almost to himself. "And for those of us who watched, it's a lesson we won't forget." I allowed myself a quiet smile. The lesson, indeed, was not mine alone to keep. It had been shared, observed, felt, and internalized by all who witnessed it. And as we continued our ascent into the clouds, I felt a sense of purpose, a recognition that standing firm even in silence could ripple outward in ways far greater than any one person could anticipate. The aircraft moved steadily through the sky, carrying us beyond city limits, beyond ordinary expectation, and into a space where reflection and awareness might flourish, if only briefly, above the routines of life. It was here, above the familiar terrain, that clarity seemed possible. Passengers shifted once more, now with a cautious ease. Some leaned back to admire the view outside the window, sunlight breaking through clouds, the world unfolding beneath us in soft patches of green, brown, and blue. Others remained in quiet conversation, voices low and reflective. Even the Whitmores appeared subdued, their earlier certainty replaced with thoughtful attention. Sophia Nguyen returned to the galley once again, her movements assured. I watched her for a moment, recognizing that her choices had already begun to define her presence on this flight. She would not remain on the periphery of moral courage. She had chosen to step into it, however quietly. I rested back in my seat, allowing the vibrations of the plane to carry me forward. The world below was smaller now, distant, yet the lessons learned within this cabin about power, integrity, empathy, and courage were immense. The journey was far from over. Challenges remained. Moments of doubt would arise, and the subtle tests of character would continue. But for now, there was space to breathe, to reflect, to recognize that standing firm without anger, without dramatics, without yielding was perhaps the most profound form of influence one could ever wield. The world outside the window had shifted once again. We were no longer climbing, but cruising, the endless stretch of blue sky now interrupted by the occasional wisps of clouds below. The steady hum of the engines beneath us was a reminder that we were no longer in the midst of conflict, but rather in the quiet aftermath of it. A calm had descended over the cabin, but I could feel that there was still a collective, lingering tension and awareness that the events of the flight had irrevocably changed something. Sophia had moved to the back of the cabin, but she kept her eyes flickering toward me every now and then, her gaze soft yet filled with unspoken questions. She was still processing everything that had unfolded, still internalizing the weight of her decisions. But I could see the shift in her. There was a confidence in her walk now, a quiet strength that hadn't been there before. As I sat in my seat, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The turbulence had not been from the skies, but from human interaction, from the judgments we pass based on appearances, and from the ease with which we all allowed ourselves to judge what we didn't understand. And in that moment of stillness, I realized that much of the change I'd set into motion was not in Patricia's removal, but in how it had forced those around me to reconsider their assumptions. The most profound shifts, after all, often occur in the quiet aftermath of conflict, when the dust has settled and the truths are allowed to sink in. I turned slightly, observing Edward Blake. He had been quieter since the confrontation, but his gaze had softened toward me. He had witnessed everything with a kind of quiet support that spoke volumes. I could tell that this was not the first time he had witnessed the erosion of authority, but this was the first time he had seen someone refuse to bend, refuse to let another define their worth. "Do you think people will remember what happened here?" he asked, his voice low, the question hanging between us like an unspoken challenge. I considered his words for a moment. "I think they'll remember that silence does not equate to submission," I replied, my voice calm, deliberate, but more importantly, I think they'll remember that it's not about who holds the power. It's about who chooses to wield it with integrity. He nodded slowly, his eyes thoughtful. You didn't need to raise your voice. You didn't need to fight back. You simply stood there. He paused. That kind of strength is rare. It wasn't the first time someone had commented on my calm demeanor, but hearing it from him felt different. Edward had a way of observing that made every word he spoke feel like a deliberate reflection. He had not been passive in his observation. He had understood that the stillness I'd maintained was not weakness, but a refusal to be moved by anything that wasn't true to who I was. "I've learned," I said, my tone softening, "that true strength is never about raising your voice. It's about understanding that, no matter what happens around you, you have the ability to remain grounded in your truth." His expression shifted slightly, the corners of his lips tilting upward, just a fraction. "You make it sound so simple," he remarked, "but I think that's exactly why it's so difficult. The world doesn't want us to be calm when we're being wronged. It expects us to react, to fight, to be angry. And sometimes," I said, "we need to allow ourselves to feel that anger. But we also need to recognize that acting on it in the moment only perpetuates the cycle. When you're calm, you're not just asserting control over yourself, you're inviting others to see beyond their own reactions." The words felt true in the space between us. Edward was not used to seeing someone confront authority without raising their voice, without engaging in a battle of wills. But he was beginning to understand that silence could be more powerful than shouting. We sat there for a few more moments, the steady hum of the plane filling the silence, the occasional clink of glassware from the galley, the rustling of newspapers. These were the sounds of a world that had moved on from the conflict. But there was still a pulse beneath the surface, a quiet undercurrent of reflection that kept the tension alive, albeit in a different form. The Whitmores had settled into their seats now, but I could sense their discomfort. Margaret's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, and Charles's gaze flickered over to me more than once, but he quickly averted his eyes when he realized I had noticed. There was no apology, no grand gesture to make amends for their earlier judgment. But sometimes the acknowledgement of discomfort is enough. It's a first step in understanding that the world is not as clear-cut as we think. Sophia returned to the front again, this time standing near the galley, watching me from a distance. She was observing the passengers, her eyes taking in their reactions, learning from the way they shifted in their seats when they saw her look their way. I could see that she was beginning to recognize the subtle power that came from simply being present, from standing her ground. I caught her eye and gave her a small nod of approval. She seemed to hesitate, then returned the gesture, a flicker of understanding passing between us. "Are you sure you're all right?" Edward asked, his voice gentle this time, his concern genuine. "I'm fine," I replied. "I've had much worse. This was just a moment, but it was one that needed to happen." There was a slight pause before I continued. "The truth is, people like Patricia don't wake up one morning and decide to treat others poorly. They've been conditioned by the same systems that have been in place for generations. But that doesn't make it acceptable." Edward's brow furrowed. "You're not saying this is her fault, are you? I'm not blaming her," I interrupted, "but we must recognize how deeply these patterns are ingrained. It's not just about one person's behavior. It's about all of us, and how we contribute to systems that make it easy for people to dehumanize others." The words hung between us, hanging heavier than I had intended, but also carrying a weight that needed to be said. The truth about privilege, about power, about the ways we perpetuate bias. Even when we think we're being neutral, it was uncomfortable. But that discomfort was necessary for change. Edward was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. I've never really thought about it that way. But I see it now. You're right. I looked at him, surprised. You've never had to, Edward. But now you do. His gaze softened. I guess sometimes it takes witnessing something like this to finally realize what's been hiding in plain sight. He was beginning to understand, and that was all I needed. Change didn't require everyone to act at once. It simply required a willingness to see things as they were and to let that awareness guide our future actions. Sophia walked toward us, her footsteps quiet but purposeful. She stopped just behind Edward's seat, her voice low. "Dr. Morgan," she said softly, "I need to speak with the other crew members. We need to address how we handle these situations in the future. We can't let this happen again." I nodded, giving her an encouraging smile. "I'll back you up. Sophia, you've already shown the courage to stand up." Her eyes shone with something new clarity, determination, and the quiet understanding that the world she had walked into was not the world she was leaving behind. She stepped away, her shoulders straight, her voice more confident as she moved toward the front. The rest of the flight crew watched her as she passed, and I could see that they, too, were beginning to take her lead. I settled back into my seat, the soft hum of the engines carrying me deeper into reflection. There would be more challenges, more moments of friction. But there was one truth I carried forward: when you stand firm in your dignity, even the smallest act of resistance can spark something greater. I glanced out the window again, watching the world below, now far away, as we move further into the sky. The future, just like the air we flew through, was wide open, and the journey was far from over. The rest of the flight passed in relative calm, but the ripple effect of what had occurred earlier could not be ignored. The mood in the cabin had shifted, not just in how the passengers interacted with one another, but in the quiet way they observed the world around them. It was as if, by simply being present, they had been forced to reconsider their assumptions about me, about each other, and about the way they navigated their own lives. The seatbelt sign dinged softly as the captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into our final destination. Please ensure your seatbelts are securely fastened and your trays are stowed." The voice was calm, the announcement professional. But for me, it felt like the culmination of everything that had happened, the moment when all of the tension and reflection would begin to take form, and the journey we had been on, both physical and metaphorical, would come to its inevitable conclusion. Edward sat next to me, his attention now focused outside the window, watching the sprawling city below as we descended. I had noticed the change in him earlier, where once his gaze had been sharp, observant, and perhaps slightly distant. There was now a softening, a recognition that something larger was at play. The way he watched the world outside the window now was different. It was as if he was seeing things for the first time, as though the flight had cracked open a new way of understanding the world. "I've been traveling for years," he said quietly, his voice reflecting the weight of his thoughts, "but I've never once considered how different it must be to be seen only through the lens of assumption." I turned to look at him, my expression steady. We all live through lenses. The difference is in how we choose to change them when we finally recognize their limitations. He nodded, his gaze still distant. "I've spent so much time focusing on how the world works for me that I never stop to think about how it works for others. Not really. It's uncomfortable. Celeste, realizing that I've been part of the problem all along. Awareness is the first step," I said gently. "It's the hardest one, But once you take it, it changes everything." He exhaled slowly, as though letting go of something that had been weighing on him for years. "I'll never look at things the same way again. I just wish I had seen it sooner. You're seeing it now," I replied, my voice soft but firm. "That's what matters." The plane continued its steady descent, the vibrations beneath us softening as we neared the runway. The cabin had grown quieter, more introspective. The flight attendants moved through the aisles in a subdued manner, performing their duties without the usual flair or efficiency. Their eyes, too, held the weight of what had happened, what had been revealed, and they seemed to move with a sense of purpose, as if they too were taking the first steps towards something new. Sophia had returned to the back of the cabin, her head held higher than before. She no longer appeared the same unsure young woman who had hesitated to act when Patricia first confronted me. She was standing tall now, her posture confident, her gaze focused. I caught her eye briefly, and she offered a small, private smile in return. It was the kind of smile that spoke of newfound strength, of a journey that had shifted her perception, one quiet moment at a time. I could see the shift in her in the way she moved, in the way she interacted with the other crew members, who now looked at her with a mix of respect and recognition. She wasn't just the junior flight attendant anymore. She was a voice of reason, a testament to the power of choosing to act on what was right, even when the world around you pushes you to remain silent. As we touched down on the runway, a gentle bump signaled our arrival. The plane's wheels screeched against the tarmac, and the familiar hum of the engines gradually quieted. We had reached our final destination, but for many of us on this flight, the journey itself had been far more transformative than the physical miles we traveled. The flight crew began preparing for deboarding, but I knew this flight would not be forgotten by any of us. It had changed something deeper than just our immediate environment. It had touched something fundamental about how we perceive each other, how we allow bias to influence our actions, and how we can choose to respond differently. As we taxied to the gate, I felt a quiet sense of closure. The adrenaline that had fueled me earlier had dissipated, leaving a calm that was grounded in something far more enduring than the rush of emotion that often follows a confrontation. This wasn't about winning a battle. It was about standing firm, about choosing integrity over fear, and about the way that one action, one decision, could ripple out and change the course of a story. Edward cleared his throat softly beside me. "I hope the rest of the world is ready for the kind of changes you've started here, Celeste. If it's anything like what we've seen today, it's going to be a long but necessary road ahead." I smiled faintly. It always is. Change doesn't happen overnight. It happens when we finally decide to confront the systems that hold us back from seeing each other as equals. "And that's what you've done today," he said quietly. "You forced us to look at each other differently, and that's more powerful than any law or policy could ever be." "Maybe," I said, turning my gaze toward the window once more. "But policy and law can help. They just need to be enforced with intention, with the same integrity we all owe each other." Edward's gaze softened. "I'll make sure to do my part." As we began to disembark from the plane, Sophia was one of the first to approach the cabin door. She stepped aside for the passengers to pass through, offering each one a polite nod. But as she glanced up at me, there was a new sense of pride in her expression. "Thank you for showing me that standing up doesn't always mean shouting," she said quietly. "You'll do more than stand up." "Sophia," I replied, my voice soft but filled with conviction, "you'll lead by example, and that's the most powerful way to change the world." She nodded, her face glowing with a mixture of gratitude and newfound determination. As the last of the passengers filed off the plane, I took one final look around the cabin. The seats were empty now, but I felt the weight of everything that had happened within these walls. The passengers would disperse, and the story of what transpired here would spread. Some might forget it, others would carry it with them. But for those of us who had witnessed it, this flight would remain a defining moment, a reminder that integrity, empathy, and quiet strength can create lasting change. The final call came for me to leave the aircraft. I stood up, smoothing my blazer, feeling the weight of the day settle into my bones. But I carried with me the quiet knowledge that, in this small corner of the world, I had made a difference. I walked down the jet bridge, my steps measured and steady. I had come to the airport as a passenger, a woman who had been underestimated. I was leaving as someone who had refused to be silenced, someone who had chosen to stand for what was right, and in doing so, had changed the course of her own journey and perhaps, just perhaps, the journeys of those who had watched her do it. And as I stepped into the terminal, the noise of the world outside washed over me. But I was not the same person who had entered this flight. I had arrived with uncertainty, but I was leaving with clarity. And the world, as I now saw it, was far more open and full of possibility than I had ever imagined. As the plane touches down, Celeste's journey isn't over, it's only just begun. Through her quiet strength, she not only reshapes the flight's atmosphere, but challenges the very system that allowed injustice to thrive. Her refusal to bow to prejudice and disrespect forces us to reflect how often have we stood by, accepting what was wrong because we felt powerless to change it. In this story, we see the ripple effect of one woman's courage, not just in Patricia's downfall, but in how the passengers, the flight attendants, and even the viewer are forced to confront their own biases. It's a reminder that silence isn't always strength, but the choice to speak out and stand firm in your truth can move mountains. It's more than just a tale of an airplane incident. It's about dignity, accountability, and the fight for respect. As we move forward in this journey, let's not forget the lessons Celeste has taught us. Every small act of resistance against inequality can spark something bigger. If this story resonated with you, like, share, and subscribe to stay tuned for more thought-provoking content. Together, we can continue the fight for justice and change. See you in the next video.